So Herodotus has said, call no man órvιος before he's dead. So the usual interpretation of this is to say that to be órvιος is to be somehow well favored by fortune, or almost to say to be happy, but happy sometimes in the sense of being wealthy or something like that. But the preferred interpretation of the passage, and then I guess with some reference to Aristotle, although it seems to be defective in the sense that Aristotle says you have to go a little beyond death. To be dead would be necessary for evaluating the whole life, but there's still a little more, because if Trump were to die and then immediately afterwards his children were to suffer some horrible reversal of fortune, then it's as though his suke in the next realm would hear about it, and then we couldn't really evaluate his fate until sometime after he was dead. So that common interpretation seems to be wrong. The preferred interpretation seems to be that órvιος means someone who's blessed in the sense, or blissful in the sense that Homer uses. That's how it speaks. Uses the epithet of the blissful theoi, or the blissful gods, or something like that quite frequently. And to be a god means to be part of a hero cult, or part of a so like Socrates and in fact both Helen among the Spartans and Socrates at Athens were objects of cults in the sense of being órvιος. So this saying, so could we call Kirk, Charlie Kirk, órvιος, is the question of whether he's become an object of veneration in the sense of cult worship, which means that people would then treat this as theos, or as a model of character. So there's some jump between the cult worship version, and then like by the time Cicero was around, it would have been consciously the idea of trying to shape people's character through the example, which is practiced systematically in schools. It's also called ethopoiesis, the creation of the artificial creation of the race, or the ethnos. So let's try to ask this question. That was just sort of a opening taste of tried to give the post flavor of verbal talk could be called a post. But the main thing I wanted to look at is the Charlie Kirk's so-called debate with Briahna Gray under the notion. So I tried to how did the Soviets put it? Rehabilitate Briahna Gray by making her, if such is necessary. I think such is necessary in a way because their ratings aren't all that high. By making her more interesting, by presenting her as a public character that's come out of the main CIA matrix, although she herself isn't. I'm not implying she herself is a CIA agent, but only that because if we theorize that the think tanks are in the Beltway around DC, from which her career originated, on the Hill news media outlet was one of her big employers before she got fired for sort of flicking or rolling her eyes when she was fed up with something an Israeli was saying. And so we could see that her firing then would appear to be due to offending the current CIA attack, so which is to be in line with A200 and to be in line with the Mossad. and almost seemingly to follow orders from them. So like with the Trump falling in line with Netanyahu and so on. And allegedly for the reason that they have some kind of blackmailing capacity over the CIA. CIA understood as both the head of the corporation of understood by Article 2 in the Constitution as the executive, but also as being part of the aggregate dark state, as Dugan has been calling it. I call it, after Gramsci, I call it the dominance entity. But understood as including all the big U.S. corporations and media outlets, especially the ones that are like the New York Times, which is where the Salzburgers have specifically signed agreements with the CIA. So that these seem to be directly state media in the purest form. But that whole aggregation understood as sort of idealized as one thing, even though there's lots of things happening in lots of different nooks and corners, and the floorboards are creaking and there's skeletons all over. But and with some, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing and so on. But just taken that way, we could say this is a thing that to sort of go into Humean phenomenology, into that punctum that humans cut us open with, it's a nasty, smarting cut. People don't know sort of whether causality exists, as humans brought this out with his phenomenology, with his early form of phenomenology, sort of with the form of phenomenology in his early work. And yet this question of constantly trying to read a why into things, into the transition from one state to the next, leads us to want to say there's these type of theories. There's this one unified entity, the dark state, and this is its, and then to sort of give them intelligence, to create them as an intelligent being, and then to say what is it thinking, why does it do this, why does it do that, and then we kind of come to this theory that one part of which is just what I said, it's reacting to the blackmail from A200 or from Israel, and therefore it does certain things, and then to give other parts of analysis. So the one part of analysis I try to do on that score is to look at it this way, is to say we know we can connect this up to high theory by saying what does that 1985 document sort of indicate in terms of what we can then project out and ask, like, what's happening today. So the 1985 document, which like Foucault, it said Foucault is on our side. How that links us in is that Foucault had come out heavily against universalist projects. And then in 1985, still the NATO bloc felt the Warsaw Pact and the Eastern and the Soviet Union as its mortal enemy, and as war being battle and death being in play. So that it said this is the project of the Soviet Union. So you could look then in like other sort of orthopraxis, perfect agents of this dark state, like Kotkin. you could look at what Kakin says, and his narrative is to say the Soviets really, truly believed in communism up until this date, or something like that. But that it went. But his main thesis is what the Inside the Beltway version says is they really believed in their universalism. So therefore, when Foucault came out against universalism, they said, that's great that the strongest thinker in France is on our side and against Soviets. That's a simple calculus. But then you could do a lot on that, just on that basis, and to sort of point you in the directions of different issues. I'll just say one thing in general. It seems necessary to say that, so one, the implication of this view is twofold. It's one, that it's taken for granted that invisible hand logic is something totally different than the Catholic view of the world, or that Hayek, say in the highest form, Hayek's probably the highest form. These type of Milton Friedman's like a soldier in the political realm, and I like Milton Friedman, but I like Hayek better as a thinker. So like Hayek is probably the highest form of this, and it's so high that nobody cannot really understand it properly. And so therefore there's constant debates on what Hayek really meant about many very fundamental, direct issues. But the point is, Hayek was no Catholic and no universalizer, but rather he's believed that the forces have to be very dispersed, and the only real universal statement you're making is that it's more efficient to allow things to happen this way. Why efficiency is the thing that matters the most is somehow like left unanswered. Why should the efficient economy be a more important thing than the nobility of morals? Why should the nobility of capital be more great amongst us moderns than the nobility of morals was for the tradition? This is sort of the type of question where Hayek never touches upon, but I would see the whole thing more Heideggerian, from a Heideggerian perspective, as playing as the technological essence, as sort of intervening on this type of theories that only want to pretend they're talking about economics, but which somehow, once economics concerns accelerationist topics, it becomes something else. There's a transcendental breaking point of some kind. So let's look at the debate actually for a second, and just I sort of posing it this way: as here's the person, Briahna Gray, who has been kicked out of the sanctum sanctorum, so to speak, of the intermediate approved media of the dark state, has now started to like practice all kinds of different approaches which were formerly forbidden to her from within that rarefied air. So then you have her talking to the representative of sort of this Sarkozy side, which is, so it's interesting that so far as I know, Charlie Kirk has never mentioned Will Durant, but he sort of has a Will Durant attitude towards things. Let's emphasize the good things in a way. Let's not infinitely dwell on our worst problems. Let's not try to touch the wound. Let's instead, the Catholic system is already tilting towards a Spinozaist socialism, and Will Durant takes up the flag of that. But let's be calm about it, and let's not let's do it in the rationalistic way. But then the funny thing about Kirk's rationalism is it basically consists of denying problems like systematic racism in America. So that's one of the big points that they're talking about is whether systematic racism is, as according to Kirk, a mythological figure, Zeus or Pegasus, or whether, as Briahna Gray said, it's a matter of things like disproportions in legal outcomes. And then you can look and ask on that basis whether it's actually happening. So, I mean, to me, I think the problem with the discussion was there was no ability to force people to agree on the simple definition of what systematic racism means or is intended to mean by the usage, just a simple usage. It's not to find it something transcendental. It's not to go outside of the universe, but just to say, what do the people that are using the word mean by it? And then to say, does this exist or doesn't it exist? That seemed to never happen in the discussion. And it was kind of a flirtation with rules of free speech, as it were, where free speech means something like urbane or speech full of punctilio, so that there's sort of a fog of sort of aesthetic non-dogmatism. So each person pretends not to be dogmatically devoted to their view, but to be appealing to some kind of neutral rules which everyone must somehow accede to if they're of normal mental capacity, in some kind of maybe in some kind of Stanford Binet sense, like, which is always questionable, because you never know where the direct sense, the inborn sense of an intelligent person comes from, as opposed to how much specific knowledge counts, like in the sense of, if you're Zuckerberg and your parents make sure you know words like eschew and abjure and other words that not everyone knows, then you can ace that test because you've been made ready for it, you've been coached. But on the other hand, there are certain things which you couldn't, no training would change it. That somebody's born without either a physical ear that's good for tones and for music, or without whatever the inner correspondent, the inner passion, or the inner sensitiveness to the world of that phenomenon, namely music. If that's lacking, then nothing's going to help that. So in the same way, something in the Stanford Binet test demands that the core of a certain type of intelligence be treated as the core of intelligence as such. Under that way of thinking, we developed this feeling that a discussion of this type that they were sort of flirting with, but not quite reaching. And I think the main reason they didn't reach it was not that either one of them were ill-informed about the whole mode of debating or about the subject matter, but it seemed to me, because Gray on her side took up a intellectualist attitude, which is sort of insistent on the how should I put that? There's a self-respect of the intellect that says this thing must be stated clearly from the weights and measures division of the intellect, which stands in contradistinction to a sort of, this is politics as political theater happens, and this is the way one talks in such an exchange, and this is what's effective. Something like that. And then Kirk took up the view of sort of like saying the thing which seems to be defective from the point of view of intellectual self-respect, which is to say, I'm simply on principle going to dismiss the racial approach, touching the wound of the racial issue, and instead insist on the socio-financial approach. And then he just simply would never enter into any. So it's not that he's Polymarchus saying you can't persuade me if I don't listen, and also we outnumber you. It's not really that. It's more like he had a specific principle that he's just simply insisting, the principle that all these problems should be solved from the perspective of economic and social approach, and then try to solve things mainly on. I mean, that's sort. I don't know. In a way, that's the MLK approach, according to Zizek. So it's like, I mean, that economics makes a big difference in terms of empowering people in their representation. And that's supposedly the tough way to handle it. But I would say that's that's it. It just enters into a sphere of sort of ham-headed insistence, where you refuse to actually make the comparison and do the face up to the matter yourself, which is the matter being, is it actually that no approach that treats the question of systematic racism can be productive, can be productively, there can be a productive intervention into it that solves the problem. Because people are, I think that there's an element of it, people just think it's private association means that if people don't like the smell of the other people or anything like that, it means then they're just not going to let those people in. And so they think it's just to keep going into it is just a quagmire, endless slough of despond, as the Pilgrim's Progress puts it. But that's not at all obvious. So I mean, I would say that, to me, the systematic racism, what it means is sort of like the Mark Twain thing, lies, damn lies, and statistics. So what happens is, de facto, you have a depreciation of your agency through aggregation with the group. So it's like, if African Americans de facto have higher proportional crime rates, and then if people hear about that, and then if you're especially working with people in a situation where strong arm robbery is possible, as a taxi driver, as a prostitute, and other things like that, as a street level merchant, and anywhere where the physical confrontation is possible, then you're bound to take this aggregate view, this stereotype. It's sort of like it's better to go with the stereotype than not, and then at length it becomes more part of the instincts. Then the problem is, even though it's based on something that's de facto the case, let's say it is de facto the case that blacks proportionally commit more strong-arm robberies than Latinos or whites. The result is that the African Americans or blacks who don't do that, and who aren't at all disposed to do it, or who do it, let's say there's another case who do that kind of thing less. Let's say that kind of thing means using the play of physical force to your advantage. Who do that kind of thing? So I mean, for instance, in a situation with the prostitute would prefer to go with the white guy or with the Latino guy, because they're less likely to use the disproportion of physical strength between the male and female, which usually exists, to some bad end. But you could be African American and not have that disposition any more than a Latino or a white person. And when I say that disposition, I don't mean by DNA, but I mean it could be by DNA in some sense. So I think there is some sense where there's selective breeding indicates a different group, but then again, that's difficult even to. The same problem arises with autonomy, with anatomy, as does with factors of the public character, with factors of the person or the suke. That with those, you're both ways. You're put into that aggregate. You're aggregated in a way that's not actually accurate to your individuality. So I think if looked at this way, you could counter what the post Kirk people are saying and say maybe this element of Charlie Kirk shouldn't go into be canonized or something like that. It shouldn't be part of the ortho practices because he simply didn't consider, as it were, the most morally noble form of the issue, which is to say it's unjust that somebody should be aggregated to their disadvantage, and then that the state, who could remedy the situation to some extent, doesn't try to remedy the situation to some extent, because those individuals are being